Madison Harrison was just 17 when her body was found in the ashes of a burned-out shack deep in the Arkansas woods. Her mother, Sarah, was discovered shot in the family kitchen, and her father, Richard Harrison, a quiet store owner with no criminal record, was found dead by his own hand. But as investigators began peeling back the layers of their lives, they uncovered a twisted network of secrets, lies, and criminal ties that would expose one of the darkest, most shocking family massacres in Arkansas history. What really happened inside the Harrison home, and who was powerful enough to orchestrate it all and vanish without a trace? In the quiet wooded hills of Devil's Fork, Arkansas, life moved slowly. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, where people waved to one another from their porches and still left their doors unlocked at night. Tucked away on the outskirts of this sleepy town stood the Harrison family's farmhouse, a two-story white building with green shutters, nestled behind a curtain of oak and pine. To the outside world, the Harrisons lived the kind of life most people only dreamed of. Richard Harrison, the father, owned the local hardware store and was known for his friendly smile and old-fashioned work ethic. Sarah, his wife, was a quiet, church-going woman who spent her days raising their 3 children: Madison, the oldest at 17, Lily, who had just turned 13, and Max, a curious and playful 9-year-old. They lived a simple, comfortable life. On weekends, the family often went fishing in the nearby creek or visited Sarah's sister in the neighboring town. Richard taught his kids how to use tools and fix things, just like his father had taught him. Their home was full of framed pictures and laughter, especially during the holidays when they decorated the house from top to bottom. To anyone who saw them, they were the perfect family. But everything changed on the morning of June 12, 2013. At around 8:30 a.m., a delivery driver from a local appliance company pulled up to the Harrison residence. He was scheduled to drop off a replacement part for a refrigerator Richard had ordered the previous week. As he stepped out of his truck, he noticed something strange. The front door was wide open. That was unusual. Richard was known to be careful about locking up, especially since the farmhouse was fairly isolated. The driver walked up the porch steps, knocked on the door, and called out. There was no answer. Inside, the air was still, the kind of stillness that makes the hairs on your neck stand up. Something felt wrong. The driver stepped cautiously into the front hallway, calling out again. His eyes adjusted to the dim light, and that's when he saw the first body. Sarah Harrison was lying motionless at the foot of the stairs, her head twisted unnaturally to one side, a pool of blood staining the floor beneath her. Her hands were frozen mid-reach, as if she had tried to crawl before she died. The driver backed out of the house in panic and ran to his truck to call 911. Within 30 minutes, the quiet town of Devil's Fork was swarming with emergency vehicles. Sheriff Nolan Carter, a veteran lawman with nearly 2 decades of experience, arrived on the scene and quickly realized this was no ordinary crime. As investigators moved through the house, they uncovered a scene of horror that none of them would ever forget. Madison was found in her bedroom upstairs, lying on the floor beside her bed. Her throat had been slit, and there were signs of a struggle. Broken furniture, blood smeared on the walls. Lily was found in the hallway, halfway between the kitchen and the back door. She had been shot at close range. Max was discovered in the living room, near the family's television set, his body partially hidden behind the couch. All 5 members of the family had been killed, each in a different part of the house, and each in a different manner. But something didn't add up. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken windows, no picked locks, nothing to suggest the killer had struggled to get inside. Whoever did this had either been let in or already had access. There were no valuables missing. The house hadn't been ransacked. The family's wallets, phones, and jewelry were all untouched. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. This was something far more personal. As word spread through Devil's Fork, the community was shaken to its core. People cried openly in the streets. Neighbors gathered outside the farmhouse, staring at the yellow tape and flashing lights, trying to make sense of what had happened. Grief quickly turned into fear. If the Harrison family could be murdered in cold blood in their own home, then no one felt safe anymore. Reporters from across the state descended on the small town. The story made headlines within hours. Family of 5 slaughtered in Arkansas. Home. Speculation ran wild. Some believed it was a revenge killing. Others thought it might be drug-related, though the Harrisons had never shown any signs of involvement in anything illegal. Theories were everywhere, but facts were few. Inside the house, investigators searched for clues. A footprint was found in the mud just outside the back door. It didn't match anyone in the family. There were fingerprints on a doorknob leading into the basement, but no one knew if they belonged to the killer or just a guest. A bloody handprint was discovered on the wall of Madison's room, smaller than her own, but too smudged to identify clearly. The autopsies revealed chilling details. Sarah had suffered blunt force trauma before she died. Madison had defensive wounds on her hands, suggesting she fought hard against her attacker. Lily's cause of death was a single gunshot to the chest. Max had been strangled. Richard, oddly, enough, was the last to be found. Outside, behind the shed, his body hidden under a tarp. He had been shot in the back of the head execution style. It seemed likely he had been forced outside and made to kneel before being killed. The randomness of the killings was puzzling. Different weapons, different methods, no clear motive. It was as if the killer had taken their time and wanted to send a message, but no one could figure out what that message was. The small-town police force was overwhelmed. The Arkansas State Police took over the investigation within 48 hours, bringing in crime scene analysts and profilers. FBI agents soon joined, considering the possibility of a serial killer or organized hit. But no fingerprints matched any known criminals. No DNA in the national database. The trail went cold almost immediately. The Harrison family was buried 3 days later, side by side in the town cemetery. Hundreds of mourners attended. Flowers covered the church steps. A town that had once felt safe now felt like a place where evil had walked right through the front door and left without a trace. And as the sun set over Devil's Fork that evening, one chilling question remained unanswered. Who could have done something so horrific, and why? The answers, as investigators would soon learn, were far more twisted than anyone could have imagined. In the days following the massacre, Devil's Fork transformed from a quiet rural town into the center of a high-profile investigation. Local residents, still reeling from the horror, watched as state police cruisers lined the narrow gravel road leading to the Harrison farmhouse. The media presence grew by the hour. Reporters camped outside the property, their camera lights flickering, through the trees like lightning bugs at dusk. Everyone wanted answers, but the truth remained buried beneath layers of mystery. Investigators began peeling back the seemingly perfect image of the Harrison family. Richard, Sarah, and their children had lived in the town for over a decade. They had no enemies, no criminal records, no history of violence. But behind the smiling photographs and church appearances, the first cracks began to show. Detectives learned that Sarah Harrison had recently been prescribed medication for severe anxiety and insomnia. Her doctor noted a change in her demeanor. Over the last year, she seemed jumpy, paranoid, and often distracted. Friends recalled that Sarah had become increasingly isolated. She had stopped attending church events, citing illness, though no one had ever seen her unwell. Some neighbors mentioned that she frequently peeked through the curtains during the day and had even installed new locks on every door of the house just a few months prior. Richard Harrison's financial records raised additional questions. Although the hardware store appeared to be doing well, bank statements revealed that he had taken out a second mortgage and several personal loans. The money wasn't used for business expenses, at least not according to any known records. Investigators found no evidence of new equipment, renovations, or property purchases. It seemed to vanish without a trace. There was also a significant cash withdrawal, over $10,000, made just 6 weeks before the murders. The deeper they looked, the more tangled the picture became. Madison Harrison, the oldest child, had withdrawn from school in April, less than 2 months before her death. Officially, she was marked as homeschooled, but her teachers had noticed a shift long before then. She had stopped participating in class, became withdrawn, and was seen arguing with her father in the school parking lot on more than one occasion. When asked, she would give vague answers or change the subject entirely. What troubled the investigators most was a discovery made on the night of the murders. A gas station in a town 30 miles away had captured surveillance footage of a girl matching Madison's description. The footage was time-stamped around 6:15 p.m. on June 11th, less than 14 hours before the family's bodies were discovered. In the video, Madison appeared anxious, frequently looking over her shoulder. She bought a bottle of water and a granola bar, then left in a car driven by a woman the station clerk didn't recognize. This alone would have been strange, but what made it more disturbing was that Madison's body, according to the coroner's report, had been dead for nearly 24 hours at the time the family was found. The timeline no longer made sense. Either the coroner's report was wrong, or the girl in the video wasn't Madison. Investigators cross-checked every angle of the gas station footage. Though grainy, the girl looked unmistakably like Madison, down to the pink hoodie she was often seen wearing. But the woman driving the car was a mystery. She wore dark sunglasses and a baseball cap, her face partially obscured. The car's plates were unreadable. Attempts to track down the vehicle led nowhere. Detectives interviewed dozens of people, friends, relatives, teachers, employees at the hardware store. One of the store's part-time workers, a teenager named Eric Whitman, mentioned something strange. He said that over the last year, Richard had been making odd late-night trips to the store. Richard claimed he was just catching up on paperwork. But Eric found it strange that he would always turn off the security cameras when he arrived. When asked why he did this, Richard had brushed it off, saying he didn't like being watched. The mystery deepened when investigators examined the store's financial records more closely. Certain transactions didn't add up. Some orders were marked as paid in cash, but never showed up in the bank deposits. Several invoices were missing or incomplete. A forensic accountant was brought in, and it soon became clear. Someone had been moving money under the radar. Whether it was Richard or someone else was still unclear. Then came a new lead, one that turned the investigation on its head. A retired police officer who had once worked narcotics in the county called in a tip He recognized the woman in the gas station footage. Though the image was unclear, he believed it was Vanessa Cole, a former Devil's Fork resident who had a long and troubled past. She had disappeared nearly 10 years ago after serving time for drug trafficking and assault. No one had heard from her since. Most believed she had left the state or died. But if the tip was accurate, she was back, and possibly involved. Vanessa Cole had a history with Richard Harrison. Long before he married Sarah, the two had dated for nearly 3 years. Their relationship ended badly. Police records from the early 2000s showed multiple domestic disturbances involving the two, although no charges were ever filed. Vanessa had a reputation for being unpredictable and violent when under the influence of drugs. She was also known for her connections to a regional meth operation that had once run out of the very county Devil's Fork sat in. When detectives tried to trace Vanessa's last known whereabouts, they hit a wall. Her name hadn't appeared on any lease, job application, or utility bill in over a decade. It was as if she had disappeared off the grid. But if she had reappeared on the night of the murders, especially with Madison in the passenger seat, the implications were enormous. Investigators began to theorize that the Harrison murders might not have been a random act of violence or even a case of domestic tragedy. There was growing suspicion that Richard had gotten involved in something illegal, perhaps trying to pull out of a deal gone wrong. Sarah's anxiety, Richard's financial troubles, Madison's sudden withdrawal from school, it all pointed to a family under immense pressure. One thing was certain. The killer, or killers, knew the Harrison family. They knew the layout of the house, they knew the family's routines, and they likely had help. Whether Madison had escaped that night, or was forced to flee, was still unknown. But one thing haunted the detectives as they pored over the evidence. If Madison had survived even briefly, then somewhere in the chaos, there was still a living witness. And if Vanessa Cole really was back, the motive behind the massacre might be darker than anyone had imagined. The search for Vanessa Cole quickly became the primary focus of the investigation. With her possible reappearance caught on the gas station surveillance footage, she moved from being a footnote in Richard Harrison's past to the central figure in a case that had stunned the entire state. Investigators combed through old records, arrest reports, court documents, and statements from former associates. Vanessa had always been a ghost in the system, slipping through cracks, changing names, vanishing from sight when things got too hot. But now she had resurfaced, and the question was why? Detectives interviewed people who remembered her from Devil's Fork, and what they uncovered painted a picture of a woman shaped by anger, rejection, and instability. Vanessa was born and raised in the area, the youngest of 3 sisters in a household marked by violence and poverty. Her mother died when she was 16, and by 17 she had dropped out of school and was running with a rough crowd. When she met Richard Harrison, she was 19 and already on probation for theft. Richard, then in his early 20s, had just taken over his father's hardware store. Despite their differences, they were inseparable for a time. But it didn't last. The relationship soured after 2 years, reportedly due to Vanessa's increasing drug use and volatility. Friends recalled loud arguments and broken windows. One neighbor remembered hearing shouting and then seeing Vanessa drive off in the middle of the night, her tires kicking up gravel, her face streaked with tears. Richard never spoke about her afterward, not to friends, not even to Sarah, as far as anyone knew. Vanessa disappeared from Devil's Fork a few months later after a brief stint in county jail. She was charged with assault during a drug deal gone bad, but served only 8 months. Once released, she vanished. Authorities believed she had left Arkansas, maybe headed west. For years, there had been no sign of her, until now. The possibility that she had been involved in the Harrison family murders sent shockwaves through the community. But the bigger question remained: if Vanessa had returned, what had brought her back? And how did Madison Harrison end up in her car? A break in the case came when a park ranger in northern Arkansas reported finding an abandoned vehicle in the woods just off a logging road. The area was remote, miles from the nearest town. The ranger had been performing a routine check of the trails when he noticed the car, its windows fogged with moisture, its tires flat, covered in pine needles and dust. Inside there were fast food wrappers, an empty duffel bag, and a phone with a cracked screen. The VIN matched a vehicle registered to Vanessa's older sister, who lived in Missouri. When questioned, she claimed the car had been stolen nearly a year earlier. She never reported it, afraid the police wouldn't believe her due to her own criminal history. The car was towed and processed for evidence. Forensics revealed strands of dark hair matching Madison Harrison's DNA, found on E4. The backseat headrest, but there was something else. Blood, smeared across the inside of the passenger door. The analysis later confirmed it was Madison's. What it didn't explain was how much blood there was, enough to raise fears that she may have died in that. Card investigators expanded their search into nearby forested areas. Search teams combed through the underbrush, ponds, and abandoned cabins. Then, deep in the Ozarks, they found what they were dreading: a burned-out shack, barely standing, half consumed by fire. The stench of smoke still lingered in the air. Inside the charred remains, searchers discovered 2 bodies. The medical examiner confirmed the worst. One body belonged to Vanessa Cole. The second was believed to be Madison, though positive identification required dental records due to the state of the remains. Both had been shot before the fire started. Ballistics revealed that the same weapon had been used in both deaths, but strangely, no gun was found at the scene. Whoever killed them had taken it and started the fire to cover their tracks. First, investigators believed this was the end of the road. Vanessa had killed the Harrisons and taken Madison. Then, in a final confrontation, perhaps the girl had tried to escape, forcing Vanessa to kill her before turning the weapon on herself. But the forensics told a different story. Vanessa had been shot in the back of the head. Madison had been shot in the chest. There was no soot in their lungs, meaning they were dead before the fire started. There were also drag marks outside the cabin. Someone had moved the bodies before setting the fire. It was unlikely Vanessa had committed suicide. More likely she and Madison had been silenced. Now investigators were left with a disturbing theory. Someone else had been in that cabin. Someone with a motive strong enough to kill them both and destroy the evidence. The journal found in the Harrison basement became critical. Discovered behind a false wall, it contained months of entries written in Madison's careful handwriting. They revealed a teenager living in fear, convinced her father was hiding something dangerous. She wrote about strange visitors, late-night phone calls, and overheard conversations about deliveries and payouts. Madison believed her father was involved in something illegal, possibly connected to the same drug ring Vanessa had once run with. Madison had been trying to gather proof. Some entries suggested she had followed her father at night. Others hinted that she had spoken to Vanessa at least once before the murders. The final pages were hurried and fragmented. One line stood out: "If anything happens, it wasn't her idea. She's helping me get out." The discovery raised new possibilities. Was Vanessa trying to protect Madison? Had they both become targets after learning too much? And if so, who was pulling the strings behind the scenes? Law enforcement shifted their focus. It was no longer about a jealous ex or a family tragedy. The murders now looked like part of a larger operation, one that had gone unchecked in Devil's Fork for years. The quiet town had hidden its secrets well. But now those secrets were coming to light. Phone records, financial transfers, and hidden transactions from the hardware store began to reveal connections to known criminals operating in the region. Some of the names matched those in Vanessa's arrest records from years ago. Richard may have tried to back out. Vanessa may have been trying to make amends. Madison, caught in the middle, had become the ultimate threat to people who couldn't afford to be exposed. As the pieces came together, one thing became clear. The Harrison massacre was never just about revenge or anger. It was about power, silence, and the cost of knowing too much. And somewhere out there, the person who gave the final order was still free. The hunt for the person behind the murders intensified. With Vanessa Cole and Madison Harrison now confirmed dead, investigators turned their attention to the network that seemed to loom behind the scenes, a web of old connections, hidden cash, and secrets that had simmered beneath Devil's Fork for decades. The revelation that Richard Harrison may have been laundering money through his hardware store was no longer speculation. It was fact. But what no one could yet explain was how an average small-town store owner ended up entangled with a criminal operation sophisticated enough to erase people without a trace. A pattern began to emerge from the forensic accountant's findings. Over the past 3 years, large amounts of untraceable money had flowed through shell accounts linked to businesses in neighboring towns, auto shops, salvage yards, even a small trucking company. All of them had ties to a man named Darrell Kane. Kane was a former mechanic turned businessman with a history of fraud and suspected drug distribution. Though never convicted, he had been investigated more than once by federal authorities. He operated quietly, never drawing attention, always staying a few steps ahead. The connection between Richard and Kane came through a third party, a man named Louis Braddock, who had once worked for Kane and later moved to Devil's Fork. Braddock had kept a low profile in town. He worked odd jobs, mostly maintenance and repair work, and lived in a trailer on the edge of the woods. When detectives brought him in for questioning, he was calm, even cooperative. He admitted he knew Richard, but denied any knowledge of illegal activity. His demeanor shifted only slightly when asked about Vanessa Cole. He paused, then claimed he hadn't seen her in over 10 years. But phone records painted a different story. Calls between Braddock and a burner phone registered to a fake name were frequent in the weeks before the murders. That burner phone had also pinged near the gas station where Madison was last seen alive. Braddock was placed under surveillance, and his movements tracked for several days. One night, officers watched as he drove to a rural property 15 miles. Outside of Devil's Fork, the house appeared abandoned, boarded windows, rusted mailbox, overgrown grass. But Braddock entered through a side door and stayed inside for nearly 2 hours. When he left, he carried a small duffel bag. Investigators waited until he was gone, then obtained a warrant. Inside the house, the team found evidence that someone had been living there recently. A mattress on the floor, food wrappers, and a small locked trunk under a loose floorboard. Inside the trunk were several photos, grainy but clear enough to identify. One showed Madison Harrison and Vanessa Cole standing outside what looked like the same burned-out shack where their bodies had later been found. Another showed Richard Harrison shaking hands with a man who appeared to be Daryl Kane. There was also a notebook filled with names, dates, and payment records. It detailed transactions that matched the sums missing from Richard's business accounts. Most chilling were the final pages, where someone had written a list titled Loose Ends. 3 names were circled in red: Madison Harrison, Vanessa, Cole, and, shockingly, Sarah Harrison. It was the first direct suggestion that Sarah may not have been an unintended victim, but rather part of the cleanup. This changed the trajectory of the investigation. The prevailing theory shifted again. Sarah, long believed to be a casualty of her husband's secret life, may have known more than anyone assumed. Perhaps she had discovered what Richard was involved in and threatened to expose it. Perhaps she tried to protect her daughter. Or perhaps she had become a liability in the eyes of those pulling the strings. The focus returned to Daryl Kane. His name appeared too often to be coincidence. But getting to Kane wasn't easy. He kept layers of people between himself and any illegal operations. When agents attempted to interview him, his lawyer declined on his behalf. Kane wasn't just careful, he was insulated. Attempts to flip Braddock also failed. Despite the mounting evidence, he refused to speak beyond vague denials. He claimed the photographs were planted, that he had never seen the notebook before, and that he had nothing to do with the Harrison murders. But then came an unexpected twist. A woman named Leah Montgomery came forward, claiming she had once dated Braddock and still spoke to him occasionally. She described him as paranoid, secretive, and obsessed with the past. When shown a photo of Madison, Leah broke down. She claimed that Braddock had once mentioned a kid who saw too much, and that he regretted letting her live long enough to run. Leah didn't know the full story, but she remembered something else. Braddock had once mentioned a safe hidden at a job site, a place he believed no one would ever check. Investigators followed the lead to an old grain silo outside of town, a location where Braddock had worked briefly the year before. Hidden behind a false panel inside a storage shed, they found a small fireproof safe. Inside were several USB drives and envelopes stuffed with cash. The drives contained documents, contracts, coded emails, and surveillance photos. One folder was labeled Final Plans. It included layouts of the Harrison property, timestamps of the family's routines, and disturbing notations like neutralize by morning and leave no witnesses. This was the break the investigators needed. The files linked Braddock to not just the planning, but the execution. They also included communication logs with someone using the alias DC. The language used was careful, never naming anyone outright, but the context left little doubt. Daryl Kane had given the order. Braddock had carried it out. With enough evidence now to charge Braddock, he was arrested in the early morning hours of a rainy Thursday. Still, he said nothing. His face remained blank as he was led into custody. Kane, meanwhile, vanished. When authorities arrived at his home with a warrant, he was gone. His phone was turned off, his bank accounts drained, his vehicle abandoned in a parking garage in Little Rock. It was as though he had evaporated. Despite an active manhunt, Kane was never found. In the end, Braddock stood trial alone. He was convicted on multiple counts, including conspiracy to commit murder and obstruction of justice. The jury deliberated only 6 hours before returning a guilty verdict. He received life in prison without the possibility of parole. But the man who orchestrated the massacre from the shadows remained at large, his name unspoken in court, his face never shown on camera. the Harrison murders left a permanent scar on Devil's Fork. The house was eventually demolished, replaced, with a memorial garden. Locals stopped speaking about what happened. The town tried to heal, but a quiet fear lingered, because they all knew the story wasn't truly over. Not while the one who started it all was still out there. Every town has a story it tries to forget. For Devil's Fork, that story was the Harrison murders, but forgetting proved impossible. Even years after the tragedy, the weight of what happened lingered over the town like an old storm cloud, too heavy to blow away, too dark to ignore. People moved on, at least outwardly. Businesses reopened, schools resumed, and newcomers unaware of the horror bought homes along the same streets that once bustled with sirens and investigators. But for those who remembered, there were no clean slates, only questions. The man believed to have orchestrated the massacre, Daryl Kane, was still missing. The official stance was that he had likely fled the country using false documentation. His network had been vast, and his influence deeper than most people realized. When agents swept through his known properties, they found hidden rooms, encrypted computers, and documents written in code. But they found no trace of Kane himself, not a fingerprint, not a surveillance image, not even a DNA sample. He had disappeared completely, leaving behind chaos and corpses. Braddock, the man who carried out the plan, remained in prison. He spoke only once, and not to police. A prison chaplain claimed Braddock had confessed in general terms, admitting to making sure the girl didn't talk. He never named who had given the orders, and when pressed, said only that it wouldn't change a thing. He refused all media requests and lived in silent isolation within the prison walls, untouched by the outside world. For investigators, the case was technically closed, at least on paper. But unofficially, there were those who never stopped digging. One of them was Agent Claire Rollins. She had joined the task force during the final months of the investigation, just as the safe house discovery turned the case on its head. Unlike many of her colleagues, she didn't believe in loose ends, and Kane's vanishing act had never sat right with her. Rollins spent the next 3 years quietly chasing leads, combing through Kane's financials, analyzing patterns, talking to former associates now willing to speak under immunity. She built a map, both literal and figurative, of every place Kane had touched, every person he had used, every lie he had told. What she found was disturbing. Kane had been more than a drug trafficker or money launderer. He had been a manipulator, someone who used people's secrets against them. And Richard Harrison hadn't been the only one under his control. There were whispers of others, teachers, police officers, even a judge, who had looked the other way over the years. Most of them had since retired or relocated. But the suggestion that Devil's Fork had been partially governed by fear and quiet coercion shook Rollins to her core. She realized that Vanessa Cole may have been trying to escape that world, and that Madison Harrison had simply uncovered too much. She also knew that Kane's ability to disappear likely hadn't been his alone. It had been paid for, protected, and planned. Then, in the spring of the 4th year since the murders, Rollins received a package at her home. No return address. Inside was a flash drive and a single Polaroid photo. The photo showed a man sitting on a bench in what looked like a European plaza. His face was older, bearded, but unmistakably Daryl Kane. On the back a message. He never ran. He was invited. The flash drive contained surveillance footage from an airport overseas, showing Kane boarding a private jet. The footage was 4 years old, taken just weeks after the murders. A background check on the tail number of the jet led to a holding company registered in the Caribbean, later connected to a powerful corporate entity with lobbying interests in the United States. What Rollins had suspected was now clear. Kane hadn't fled. He had been protected. Whether as a bargaining chip, an asset, or simply a liability too dangerous to leave exposed, someone had helped him vanish. Rollins brought the evidence to her superiors. An internal inquiry began, but much of the paper trail was already gone. Files were sealed, records erased. Every attempt to pull the thread ended in silence. Someone had erased Kane's presence with precision. The operation had been clean, professional, and above all, deliberate. Still, Rollins persisted. She began leaking details to investigative journalists, hoping public exposure would succeed where official channels had failed. One such journalist, Thomas Keene, picked up the story. His article, "The Ghosts of Devil's Fork," was published in a national magazine. It detailed the entire case, names, places, evidence, and questions still unanswered. It reignited public interest and led to renewed pressure on law enforcement. People began coming forward again. Old neighbors, former colleagues. One anonymous tip pointed to a storage unit rented under an alias in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Inside, agents found documents confirming that Kane had lived under at least 3 different identities since his disappearance. There were recent bank statements suggesting he was still active, still moving, still dangerous. But the final twist didn't come from Kane. It came from someone entirely unexpected. Richard Harrison's brother, Daniel. Long estranged from the family, Daniel had avoided media attention entirely. He had lived in another state for decades and hadn't spoken to Richard in over 10 years. After reading Keene's article, Daniel contacted Rollins and asked to speak in person. What he told her reframed the entire story. Daniel revealed that years ago Richard had confided in him during a brief visit. At the time, Richard was afraid, not of Kane, but of someone even higher up. He never gave a name, but referred to them only as the man behind the wall. He said if anything ever happened to his family, it wouldn't be Kane pulling the B strings. It would be the person Kane answered to. Richard believed that one day someone would come to clean house. That he, Sarah, and especially Madison, were liabilities waiting to be erased. Daniel had dismissed it as paranoia back then. But now, looking back, he saw the truth in Richard's fear. And with that confession, a new theory emerged. Kane may have given the order, but someone else had written the script. It was the kind of case that defied resolution. Too many players, too many secrets, too many ghosts. In the end, Devil's Fork never fully recovered. The town became a symbol of silence, of complicity, of what happens when power festers unchecked in quiet places. Madison Harrison's name became a rallying cry for journalists and investigators alike. Her face, once on missing posters, now adorned the walls of advocacy groups demanding reform in rural justice systems. No one ever saw Daryl Kane again. If he was alive, he stayed hidden. If he was dead, he left no trace. But the shadow he cast remained. Sometimes the worst crimes aren't committed in the dark. They're committed in plain sight, protected by people who smile in public and vanish in private. The Harrison massacre wasn't just a family tragedy. It was a warning. And for those still listening, the echoes of that warning have never stopped.